Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. We've reached the final part of our pre-scene analysis for NCTech. We're going to be focusing in on pages 8 to 11 inclusive. I hope that if you've had a chance to look at pre-scene video part 1 and indeed part 2, that they've been helpful to you and that you're getting a little bit more informed in terms of this particular company and its position in this particular environment. Do remember that we've got plenty of time up until the big day, so just take it in bite-sized chunks and make sure that you're building into your studies some good old question practice and indeed mock exams. You'll see that I've sort of started in a slightly unusual place here. I'm a little bit squashed for place up top. So I've had to put my sort of titles down here. You'll remember my key from pre-scene videos 1 and 2. Hopefully I don't need to go through that. That makes sense to you now, I would have thought. So this particular video has quite a lot of juicy information in it, namely because of the fact that we're dealing with the area concerning the strategic information. So if I just pop up to the top here and we'll sort of start where we left off, the current strategic position. So this is the examiner and the ACCA giving us some background information in relation to this particular company in terms of strengths, weaknesses, etc. Move on to the next page, we'll see some KPIs. More of that in a moment. You'll note that our strategic analysis video will be very, very comprehensive. I'd encourage you, once you've got through 1, 2, and 3 on the pre-scene, to get stuck in to the strategic analysis. For me, that's as important, if not slightly more important than the pre-scene analysis, because of the fact that a strategic analysis of a company really gives you a proper and comprehensive feel for just about everything. What we're doing within that analysis note is wheeling out tools and techniques, Porter's 5 forces, SWOT, etc., etc., etc. So it's really going to inform you as to your position as if you were an employee, a consultant, etc. And we're going to pick up some very, very good information. You know, I always think, as I said within pre-scene video 1, that if students who are presented with a pre-scene prior to the exam and indeed an unseen on the day, if they walked into the exam hall, if there was an exam hall, and the company that they were being examined on was not the pre-scene company, it was actually their employer, would the questions be easier to answer? I think they would. Why? Because your real life job, you're very, very familiar if you're working at the moment with your employer. So if you saw a set of SBL questions that relate to your employer, you'd be eating them up real quick. So the analogy there, I know, is a little bit odd, but it's the same sort of thing. We need to put you in a position where you're sort of thinking like an employee of this company and that you really understand the company, you know, where it's been, where it is now, and where it could go. And how better to do that than our 3-part pre-scene video series, but also in particular our strategic analysis. Don't forget about the hot issues as well, all 10 of them. That should be particularly useful. But for me, these 2 videos, i.e. pre-scene, 3-part, and indeed the strategic analysis, are the most important ones. Okay, so what do they tell us? What does the examiner provide us with here? Well, it's a fairly sort of short and bite-sized sort of strategic analysis, and certainly when you come to our video, I've sort of filled in the blanks a little bit from my knowledge of this particular industry, the research that I've done, and my sort of understanding of how to analyze a company. I've been analyzing companies for quite a few years, that's for sure. So what are we told here in relation to NCTech? Well, the first line is quite interesting, because what they say is that it periodically appraises its position and status. Now, that's clearly a hint towards, for me, formal strategic planning. In other words, really the rational or formal model, rather than any of the other approaches to strategy formulations. Do note that the technical articles, as mentioned within pre-scene video 2, are important to us. And I think that you'll find, if I'm not mistaken, and excuse me if I am, that there are 2 technical articles on the ACCA website that relate to strategic planning. I would definitely have a look at them for several reasons, not least because of the fact that those articles will help you understand this part of this particular video, but it will also help you understand the strategic analysis in more detail. The most important thing is that the SBL examiner has a tendency to build in a strategic model from time to questions. And if we're able to spot it, then we're going to score heavy in that question. Do remember, as I've said within pre-seen video 1, that in terms of the requirements within the SBL exam, more often than not, the examiner is not going to point you to a particular model, but he is going to hint at it. And the more familiar you are with the models, the easier it is to see what he's hinting at. Okay, so it seems to me the rational formal approach is relevant, so they plan over the long term. That's what it says. So I put a red flag there to say, let's be on the case. Let's understand the type of models that he tends to put into requirements. Number 1, Porter's 5 forces, pestle, Porter's diamond, etc. So taking a look down the page, you'll see that I'm highlighting in green here because I think this is all important. Yeah, we need to know what the strengths are. Now, we've seen this before. We know they have a great reputation. Yeah, for sure. We know that their relationship with clients is good. That's evidenced by the financials. And indeed, we know that in the main, notwithstanding 1 or 2 points that I'll make a little bit later, the service that they provide is very, very good and it's competitively priced. Remember, it's the basic service, IAS, rather than any of the other 2. In terms of the workforce, absolutely, a capable and competent workforce. So on the face of it, we've got a number of key strengths, but clearly when we look down below, there are some weaknesses that I think in one sense sort of outweigh the strengths. In other words, if I was to look at this company in real life, I would be a little bit concerned about some of the things that I've seen within this pre-seen document. And if I was advising the board, there's quite a few things that I think that they need to address. The first one is something that we've mentioned several times already, both in a negative and a positive sense. Here it's in a negative sense. We're restricting growth by simply offering this basic service. We know that it's highly likely that customers of NCTech are very, very cost conscious. That's why they're opting for this. This is the only service that NCTech have ever offered. But I would suggest to you, as I've said in the other 2 videos, that may well change. And I'm looking out for a task, a requirement, a question exam that sort of heads us towards that. Clearly the growth potential, is limited because of this sort of one product, as it were. Now, notwithstanding that, we know if you think about tech, your tech, my tech, anybody's tech, over time, that costs and prices are going to come down. So, it's inevitable in the future that they'll move in that direction because, it's going to get cheaper to provide that service or the other services, PAS and SAS, that's for sure. Now, second one here, this might be the biggest concern. If I was a consultant advising this company, or if I was on the board of NCTech, I would be concerned because, when we look at the market share and we look at NCTech's position in this particular market, clearly they're not one of the big boys, either in Ireland, it seems to me, and certainly not globally. Okay? So that begs the question, are they a target in some way for a takeover? They absolutely are, categorically. Would the examiner put a question in on that basis? Yeah, I think that's possible. I've seen it before. So this is an area that we need to be familiar with. And indeed, when you're looking back on past papers, when I flag certain areas, certainly with all of the red flags, I would be looking for questions in these areas, and I would be looking to the model solutions, the ACCA model solutions, say, okay, how did the writer deal with this particular issue? Number three is a concern, as they said up top in the strengths, yeah, we've got a great workforce, but, are they leaving, and where are they leaving to? I've got a good idea where they're leaving to. I think it might well be linked into number two. They're leaving for competitors. We know from the early part of the pre-scene that keeping quality staff, is difficult, and it appears to be affecting them. Now, when we look at the financial area, the metrics coming up, the KPIs, etc., there's a couple of things that I may link back into this. But for the moment, there's some issues here that should be of pretty much serious concern. And that links into number four, worsening financial performance. Now, we know that the big thing here is this area of the GP, the gross profit. And I've done some calculations for you in the next few pages that may help. Do remember that when you're trying to analyze a set of financials, let's just say that we had been given a set of financials, just P&L, balance sheet, etc. For me, when you look at an analysis, stick with the big numbers. Don't get bogged down with a lot of detail. Thankfully, the examiner has been kind enough only to give us extracts. But what I find students doing sometimes is going overboard. We just need the big numbers, and I'm going to point out what the big numbers are. When I say big numbers, I mean that when we look at the extracts, let's make sure that we can quote the numbers that have changed significantly or the numbers that we're concerned about very, very quickly. What we don't want to be doing in the exam is having to check this pre-scene more than once or twice, if at all, okay? I'm talking about rote learning some of this information. Indeed, as I've said, in terms of the green highlights, for me, this is information that we need to rote learn. Okay. The fifth and final point is reliability of internet service providers. I don't know whether or not this is overly important to us. I know it's important to NCTech, but would the examiner go in this area? Possibly, but I'm more concerned about things like restriction of growth, being taken over, and key staff leaving, and indeed financial performance, than I am on whether or not the internet is going to be reliable. And indeed, even if the internet isn't reliable, let's just say that it goes down in Farland. Well, is that down to the board? Is that down to NCTech? I don't think so. We know who it's down to. Okay, so, in terms of the first four, I guess this is something that they either can do something about or they need to do something about. Okay, so as always, and I hope this doesn't become annoying, I'm going to put on my annotations. Okay, now going back up to the top here, I've mentioned this point. I've said, do they use rational formal model? Well, absolutely they do. And for anyone who's not informed in terms of this whole area of the approach to strategy formulation, you could just easily Google Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, because the rational formal model basically says that there's a three-pronged approach to coming up with strategies. Firstly, analysis. Secondly, choice. And thirdly, implementation. Very briefly, what we mean by that is we're told that NCTech appraises its position periodically. I'm suggesting to you that they do that in a formal way. That's the feeling that I get. Now, if they do, they're using the rational formal model. That model says, number one, analyze the environment, the external environment, and also analyze yourself. I'm talking about a resource audit, strengths and weaknesses, core competence, etc., etc. So that's number one. Do your analysis. Now, what does that analysis do? What that does is it leads into a series of strategic options. So we analyze first, we analyze the environment, we analyze ourselves, we come up with 2 or 3 or 4 strategic options. Then what do? We make a choice. In other words, we choose options. We can't deal or undertake every single possible strategic option that's in play going down the line. We've got limited resources, we've got limited time. So we choose 1, maybe 2, and then we implement. So this whole idea of appraising its position and status really is the idea that the NCTech board have a team that run through one 2, and 3. And indeed, they forecast using the rational formal model in the long term. Now, I would say, and you'll see this referenced in the 2 technical articles that I've mentioned on the ACCA website in relation to strategic planning. I would say this is that the rational formal model, as sort of put forward by many proponents, not least JSW, is often criticized, and it's often compared to the Mintzberg approach, in other words, the emergent approach to strategy formulation. Now, you'll recall that I mentioned this previously in relation to the values and the energy. So really what I'm saying here is, yes, clearly, they use a long-winded approach, probably takes them 3 to 6 months, maybe more. They're trying to analyze the environment, they're trying to predict forward, they're trying to come up with strategic options, put them into play. The problem that I've got, I would say, is that this particular environment, this particular industry is changing rapidly. And that's one of the key criticisms of the rational formal approach. It's too rigid. It's too time consuming. It assumes that you can, predict what's going to happen in 3 months' time, let alone 3 weeks' time. I always love that quote by J.K. Galbraith, the famous economist in the 20th century, and his quote about forecasting is that there are 2 types of forecaster. One that doesn't know, and one that doesn't know they don't know. Okay, so in essence, what he's saying is trying to predict the economy, trying to predict the environment down the line is tricky. And bear in mind that's in the middle of the 20th century. We're now dealing with a very dynamic industry, fast moving, changing, with a lot of players in it. So maybe there's a question mark over this approach. This is up to you. Now, as I've said here, do refer back to pre-scene video 1 if what I've said up top doesn't make any sense. It's just the areas of energy and values. They talk about taking opportunities as they come. That sort of bulks against what we've just said in terms of their use of the rational formal model. If I move down into the weaknesses, you'll see that across the board in each of the 3 videos, I've made several references to Ansels's matrix. The point here is the restriction of growth. So that begs the question, as I've said several times now, well, what are we going to do about it? What options within Ansels's matrix make sense in terms of, existing services, stroke products, and indeed markets? Let's be savvy with that particular model. Now, in terms of the financial performance, more of this in a moment, but it's referenced several times. We know that there's an issue. The problem is we don't know what the issue is. Now, I guess we can think about sort of the cost of goods sold or the cost of services for a service provider such as NCTech, but to some extent it's conjecture. I think what's most important is that we recognize that there is an issue and it could be targeted in some way by the examiner on the big day, but how would he target it? Okay, so that's our sort of first page. I'll just turn off the annotations now and we'll move in to our second page. I hope that made sense to you. So what do we have here in terms of the performance dashboard? Well, in essence, I guess what we're talking about here is a sort of a data visualization tool. And in one sense, having this sort of extract, this particular section of financial reports, makes things easier for us because there isn't as much information as there would be in a full set of accounts. In one sense, it makes it more difficult because obviously the information is limited. So what I've done in terms of my analysis is just broken things down a little bit, maybe to give us some sort of ammunition to use on the day if something in this area comes up. Remember, the bottom line is that the questions that we'll be faced with, albeit for the fact that there won't be a big financial bias, we need to write or be able to write about this company, and knowing the basic information here, or as I mentioned, the big numbers, I think is important. Okay, so just looking at this side here first. Just looking at the revenues, clearly we'll see that, when we compare the 2x2 year to 2x3, there's certainly an issue, not a massive issue. And I must admit, using the sort of diagrams here, I got a little bit confused, to be honest with you, just because of the way that they presented the information. But I think I figured it out now. At least I hope I have, given that I'm trying to help you. Is it massive? Are we going to, throw our toys out of the pram based on this sort of fall? Probably not, but it's something that should be noted. Okay, is it linked in some way to this issue that we see over on the right-hand side in terms of the gross profit margin fall? Well, it may well be in some way, but let's remember the relationship between, the cost of services and revenues is set within this GP figure. So it may well not be linked in any way, shape or form. So the bottom line so far, and I will show you my calculations in a moment. The bottom line is that revenue is falling year on year and GP is falling. Now, they haven't mentioned elsewhere specifically in the pre-scene that we have an issue with revenue. They've talked on the previous page about worsening financial performance, but they haven't specifically mentioned the revenue. Does that mean that they're not overly concerned about it? Maybe. Certainly, I would probably be more concerned with this. And there's several reasons for that. The main reason is it's not just a question of the difference between 2x2 and indeed current year 2x3. It's the trend. Look at the trend here. There's an issue, and if we extrapolate that further, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about 1 to 2% per year. That's fairly significant when you talk about, gross profit margin, the sorts of numbers that are relevant to this company in terms of the financials. So there's a problem, but how can we figure out what it is? Guesswork. Okay. If I move down the page, I will move back up in a second. What else do we see in terms of the financials? Well, broadly speaking, it's the same story. Yeah. Now, again, when we look at PBT, and we see the differential, is that the end of the world? Again, are we getting our hands on our toys? I don't know that we are, but let's just note the fact that again, there's a fall. So I go back to the weaknesses and this reference to worsening financial position. If I was a shareholder, I'd be a little bit twitchy. I don't think I would be swinging punches, but I'd be a little bit twitchy for certain, and that's referenced within the earlier part of the pre-scene. The other issue here is when we talk about ROCE, we know the calculation. Now, be it for the fact that it's only percent, when we look at the numbers that we're talking of, that's a fairly significant amount of money. Yeah. So, there's clearly an issue in the financials, but because we're provided with limited information, it's difficult to figure out what it is. Is he going to target financials in a big way in the SBL exam? I would suggest not. Why? Because this is an exam about financials, and indeed, if you look back over the past papers since this exam was introduced several years ago, you won't see him doing that. So for us, let's just take away the key bits. Now, let me show you my annotations so that you'll get a better feel for what we're talking about here. Okay, so let's remember year ended 30th September. We see these references to up and down. Is that a massive fall year on year? No, but let's then note the number. Excuse me. And also note the fact that, we've got a fall. We don't like that, but we had growth the year before. So why is this happening? Our clients, our customers, are they moving away from this IAAS model and moving towards competitors? It could well be so. When we look at the gross profit margin, you'll see this is probably the biggest concern. As I say, he's referenced it several times. When I look at that figure, that's fairly significant. 6.25 from 2x1 to 2x3. 4.3 is bad enough, but 6.25, that's what I call a trend, if there ever is one. Now, note that across the board here, I put some averages in. You may think that's a little bit of overkill. Well, for me, I always like a student to show a little bit of savviness and provide me with information perhaps that other students haven't done. So, if the area of financials come up in some way, shape or form, I'd be wheeling these out just to show the fact that I'm on my game. Some part for me of passing the SBL exam is about differentiating yourself from the students around you. So if you can be different and it's quick and easy, then certainly be different. So in summary, based on the two diagrams that we see here, we have some concerns, but we're more concerned with the right-hand side. It's a question mark. What is going on? Come down into PBT and return on capital employed, same sort of thing. Now, funnily enough, on the right-hand side, let me deal with ROC before I deal with PBT. I had to do the calculation before I actually realized, do you know what? That's actually quite a significant sort of drop. 5.4% when you're talking about, in effect, a company that, not so much manufacturing, but we wouldn't expect massive ROCE given the amount of capex that they'd have to employ, or that they have to employ in order to provide their service. But for me, that's fairly significant year on year. And note that if this trend were to continue, I don't know if I would want to be on the NCTech board, certainly if the shareholders come and knocking. Okay, so this is an issue. Let's make sure that we're familiar with the numbers, certainly in the current year, and preferably with the full year on year. Okay, as I've said, we've got the averages in there, always handy, but certainly not, maybe not as useful as knowing what's the latest figure and what are the falls year on year. So in terms of the financial side, that's about it. I hope that made sense. Please do what I've said and just make sure you take away the big numbers as I've mentioned. Let's move into our next area. I'll just turn off the annotations just for a moment. Okay, so let's get into our next area. Now this is quite interesting, and I've got some sort of like add-on information at the end for you, and I hope that it becomes useful, or I hope that you think it is useful. It's just a few extra sort of KPIs that I think are going to be helpful. So first things first, bear with me 1 second. So first things first, let's just take a look, or sort of just remind ourselves as to what we're talking about here. We know that the whole idea of non-financial metrics is a big sort of theme in professional exams, and not least in the ACCA. So the inclusion of this information is useful. It's useful to businesses to measure things outside of the financial area. And certainly on the face of it, when we look at the four main areas that they've touched on here, and when we look at the detail going back to, I think it's page 5, when they introduce these metrics, certainly they have, it would appear, all of the bases covered just about. So when we think about what information is provided here, and I've done a little bit of research on this area in terms of, AWS, Amazon, etc., and Google Platform in terms of what they measure. And this is very much sort of in line with real life players within this industry. So let's look at the numbers. When we think about security breaches, are we worried here? I mean, we would expect in some way security breaches within this industry, because it stands to reason. We've got figures that are falling over the course of time. Broadly good news. When we look at service availability, doesn't seem to be any major issues here at all. We're up at 96%, and I think we've got an average of 95 from year to year. So that's pretty good, and certainly in line with what you see published figures for AWS and indeed others. Okay, if we look down the page here, now this isn't as good. I'm comfortable enough with the area of client sort of average satisfaction. You would have thought that they'll be comfortable with that, an increase year on year. This area here is a little bit of concern. And it does link with the previous page in terms of the worsening financials. There's certainly something going on when we look at the difference between 2x1, x2, and x3. There's something going on, and as you can see, there's a trend. There's a downward trend. Now, looking at the numbers, would you think, well, they're significant? Well, when I do my analysis, when my sort of annotations come up, I think you'll see that, yeah, to some extent, you could argue that it's significant. So let me do that now. Bear with me 1 second. So, what do we have? Well, do refer to page 5 if you need to, if you're not familiar with what we're talking about here. Now, so the top part of the diagram here, I'm pretty comfortable with what's going on there. What I'm not overly comfortable with is this. And it was only just in terms of the market share when I did the calculation, because I couldn't do it in my head, that I thought, well, when we look at the fall between 2x1 and 2x3, that's very significant, 30%. I had to do the calculation, as I said, to actually figure out what the number was. But that's very, very significant. And I would suggest to you that that's linked into some of the negative points that we made on the previous page. There clearly is an issue here. Now, it's conjecture to say, well, I know what the issue is. But it seems to me, given the hints and given my sort of instinct, I would suggest it's got something to do with the whole area of the single product. In other words, the idea that customers and clients in this particular market are possibly going elsewhere, or costs are coming down with competition, and there's an issue or a question mark for a given client of NCTech is, well, they don't offer PAS, they don't offer SAS, and you know what? That's what we need. That's the bottom line. So I would suggest that it may be in that area, but again, on the unseen, we've got to play what we see on the pitch on the day. But that's a big number there, okay? Outside of that, do we need to learn things like client average satisfaction? I'm not so sure about that. I'm more concerned of things that I don't like, yeah? And I don't like that at all. And I certainly don't like that number. Up top, I think it's cool. Now, I mentioned other metrics, and you'll recall from, I think it's pre-scene video 2, I believe, I hope it's not 1, but maybe it was. When we talked about metrics, it is 1 actually, it's page 5. My apologies. When we talked about KPIs and metrics, and I mentioned about my experience of marking SBL mock exams where students are required to come up with metrics, they don't do that well. So what I thought I'd do is just a little bit of research, and I found some information here. When we look at the dashboard, we think that's great. There's some great stuff in there. We're familiar with the need for non-financial stuff, absolutely, for the reasons that you're aware. What's not in there? Yeah, and I came up with a few. Yeah, I put some explanations in there. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just thinking, would he put you in a position on the day where he introduces perhaps some other measures with some numbers and asks you to comment on them? I think that's the chance. Will it be one of these 3? I don't know. But let's think about this. Let's think about not just what's in the pre-scene, but let's also think about what's not in the pre-scene, and therefore what could come up in the unseen. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory here. I particularly like the number 2 and indeed number 1, the cost per customer, for obvious reasons. So let's go back up here just for a second and put this on play. So really that concludes our sort of walkthrough in 3 parts of the pre-scene for this particular company. I hope that you found it helpful and that you're going to make it part of your work over the next few days. As mentioned from the off this evening, you have plenty of time, so do make sure that you don't dwell too much on the pre-scene, and that you make exam and indeed question practice a key part of your work. And what you should be doing within your questions and indeed within your mock exams is to build the information, or at least some of the information within these videos, into what you say, because I can tell you that that is going to impress your marker, because weaker students within the SBL exam won't do that. They may well be scrabbling around on the day trying to find information because they haven't learned stuff. Remember that some areas of this pre-scene can be rote learned. There's not lots. It's not that difficult to do. I would have thought maybe 30 minutes, an hour and a half, you'd probably be able to rote learn the key bits across the 3 videos. So I wish you well going forward. I hope that you will join me for the strategic analysis video and indeed the hot issues. Good luck with your studies, and thank you for listening.
So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you have found it useful. If you did enjoy this video and you want to see more of it, then please do visit our website www.astranti.com. We have a free ACCA SBL pre-scene pack that includes all 3 videos for the pre-scene analysis, the strategic analysis, and the top 10 pre-scene issues. In addition to that, we also have our industry analysis document and 2 ACCA SBL mock exams with complete solutions for you to practice ahead of the exam. And also, you have access to our SBL discussion board, so you and fellow students like yourself in the same position studying for this exam will be able to chat, will be able to ask questions and receive answers from our tutors. And the best part is all of this is completely free. In order to access this, please click the link in the description or visit the website www.astranti.com and sign up for our free ACCA SBL resources now. So thank you again for watching this video, and do check out that website for more free content.